Hello and welcome to the Economic Recovery and Sustainability panel discussion. My name is Karine, and this event was created for you by the Alumni Relations team at Imperial with support from the Grantham Institute for Climate Change and Environment to coincide with London Climate Action Week. We're very excited to be joined today by a panel of experts chaired by co-director of the Grantham Institute, Professor Martin Siegert. But before we begin, let's just quickly go through some housekeeping. So today you will hear from our panelists, and you're invited to shape the discussion by posting your questions. The Q&A icon appears in the top right corner of your screen, and you're welcome to submit your questions at any time. You can also like or thumbs up other people's questions so we can go through the most popular questions first. Your name will appear next to the questions that you submit, but you can also post anonymously if you prefer. Just make sure you don't include any personal information within your question. The event is being recorded, and we will share the recording with all attendees next week. And now to open this event, let me introduce Nicola Parsons, Director of Alumni Relations.
Thank you, Karine, and good afternoon, everyone. We have alumni from 30 countries registered to attend this event or receive the recording, and their graduating years range from 1969 to 2020. So a very big welcome to all of you who've joined us today, and we look forward to a stimulating discussion. So this is the first of a new series of events focusing on a topic that draws on both Imperial expertise and that of our alumni. And we are delighted that Professor Martin Siegert, who, as Karine said, is co-director of the Grantham Institute, agreed to help us shape the event and facilitate it today, particularly during a busy London Climate Change Week. The Grantham Institute is at the heart of Imperial's work on climate change and environment, and I encourage you to look at their website, on the Imperial website. There are lots of resources there. Over the coming year, we'll be working with them to help inform our alumni community about developments in preparation for the UN Climate Change Conference, COP26, taking place in November 2021. So Martin is one of our top academic ambassadors. He always takes time out to share his expertise and insights with alumni. And over the last few years, he has coincided these meetings with his trips where he has traveled, and he's met alumni in China, India, Portugal, Dubai, and the US, sometimes several times over in those countries. Now, we all know that travel is curtailed at the moment, but the advantage of this event is that we can discuss this important topic with Martin and our panel and bring and connect our alumni community around the world together on it. Martin will introduce the panel, but I'd like to take this opportunity to thank our alumni and our guests today for taking the time to share your insights and your expertise, and we really value your support. Over to you, Martin.
Thank you very much, Nicola, and Karine as well. So the topic of today's discussion is going to be on economic recovery, climate change, and of course COVID-19. So ordinarily, just a few months ago, we would have started this whole discussion by saying that it's essential that companies understand that their future needs must be compliant with zero carbon by 2050 at the latest. The UK has a legally binding commitment to do that, and also that for many of these companies and organisations, the transition required is going to be significant and pose substantial issues. Some have embraced the challenges, we'll hear about that. Some have yet to form plans. There are huge risks associated with all of this. For those that haven't yet committed to comply with zero carbon, might be feeling that they're getting left behind, especially as regulation and monetary issues become more aligned towards zero carbon. So now's the time for businesses to take action. It's probably the greatest challenge that the business world has faced since the Industrial Revolution. And if that wasn't tough enough, then COVID-19, the coronavirus, has happened to all of us and has made the problem so much more significant and challenging. So these are this is the sort of thing that we're going to be trying to discuss today, and absolutely delighted to welcome four distinguished speakers, three of them from Imperial College. Welcome to you all. The first is Lily Matson, who in 1991 graduated with an MSc in Environmental Technology. She's now the Chief Safety, Health and Environment Officer at Transport for London. Second is Priti Segu, who graduated with an MSc in physics in 1998, and then 4 years later with a PhD in physics in 2002, and is now head of pricing and execution at Legal and General Insurance. Jude Hassel graduated in 1998 in environmental technology, master's program, and is the senior policy and programs officer in sustainable development at GLA. And an external speaker, Ritu Garg, who read civil engineering and civil and environmental engineering at UC Berkeley in California, and is now a senior transport planner at Arab. Lily, we'll start with you. Maybe you can just sort of take us back through the last few months and what things have been like at TfL. TfL, of course, is something that all of us know something about and rely on. But what has the situation been like for you, and how have things changed?
Well, good afternoon, Martin. Good afternoon, everybody. Lovely to be here. So the last few months, I mean, I think both at a personal level and at an organisational level have probably been some of the most challenging in my career since my time at Imperial. If we think about what you really want with transport, and I'm very much involved with transport, is that you don't notice it. It's just part of how a city operates. And our ambition is that you have such a seamless network of sustainable transport choices in London, from the underground to the bus to bikes to walking. You never really notice what you're doing and you just get on with living your life. But obviously with COVID-19, everything stopped, and literally for us everything has stopped. So we had to work very quickly, working very closely with central government to dissuade. It felt so wrong, having worked for my whole life to get people to use sustainable transport choices, to say no, don't use the underground network, don't use the bus network. And that messaging, driven very much by the central government messaging, was incredibly effective. So 98% of journeys disappeared almost overnight. The graphs are really quite amazing. The underground network was empty. The bus network, again, declined by around 80%, and car traffic too. With the lockdown, London completely stopped. So for those of you listening, I'm not sure how many of you live in London. I live in inner London. It was the most amazing experience, actually. And it did bring with it some benefits. We were able to immediately see impacts on air quality. A lot of my work has been in driving improvements in air quality in London, and there have been improvements, but there were very dramatic improvements, tangible improvements seen. CO2 levels were reduced, road accidents were reduced, and in a way people could, I hope that people take, I think there was quite a lot of excitement about the reimagining of what a city could be like, with many of the changes that our overall strategy is seeking to take the city in. So the issue now is how you rebuild from here, and if you get the city back on track to a sustainable path. Because overall we have a strategy which is a journey to zero emissions on our rail network. That's by 2030. As a city overall, it's 2050, although that I think there's a lot of desire that we bring that horizon forward. And we've used the coming out of lockdown as a means of radically and very quickly reallocating road space to enable people who can't use public transport, because we're saying we're not sure it's safe enough yet to be crowded together, to walk, to cycle. And the last thing that we want in a city is to have to rely on the car, because there simply isn't space to enable those journeys to take place. But I think, if I'm honest, I think we have some real challenges ahead, both in terms of just at an organisational level, how public transport organisations like Transport for London, which are totally dependent on their public transport fares, survive when we're actively telling people not to use these services, and we have very suppressed ridership. And I guess more fundamentally, in terms of cities which depend on density, why cities are sustainable is because they are dense and people live closely together, and we reduce the need to travel. And that's what makes them fantastic places. But it's also quite challenging when you're talking about social distancing being really the only line of defence that we have against coronavirus at the moment. So I don't think we've fixed that. That's the problem that we face. I'm quite interested in hearing what people's comments and questions are on that. And thank you for having me along.
Thank you, Lily, and a good reminder that people should post their questions for the panel do that anytime you like, and we'll start to record them and sift them, and we'll come to them in a short while. Pretty, from the perspective of LNG and insurance, things must be in a completely different place now compared to where they were just a short while ago. So tell us about what the experience has been like for you.
Yeah, thanks, Martin. It's there's been ups and downs, and I think to put it into context, let me just tell you about what I'm doing at Legal & General, because it's an insurance company, and most insurance companies are completely impenetrable as to what they do. We have a big asset manager who manages £1 trillion of assets around the world, and I sit in the insurance part of the business. And what we do is actually deal with pension schemes when pension schemes are ready or able or can afford to give us the responsibility for managing paying pensioners for the rest of their lives. And that will feed into what I'm going to tell, what we'll talk about during our discussion, which is how can we use that money to basically help economic recovery. But just in the shorter term, how we've dealt with the last 3 months, and they have been crazy, as I'm sure they have been for all of you, but not as bad as they could have been for our staff. And the reason is we were already something that the jargon is agile. So we were already agile, meaning everybody already worked from home 1 or 2 days a week. And therefore, the shock of lockdown wasn't so painful for us, because in where I sit, where we do deals, you know, we went into lockdown on the 23rd of March. On the 29th of March, we signed 3 deals in a day because we were used to working remotely, and so that's been great for us, that aspect of it. The other view that we took as a firm is everybody's feeling very nervous, everything looks very bleak right now. Now is the time to step up with what we believe, and you know, our CEO is very vocal about talking about something we call inclusive capitalism, which is using the money we get to invest when we take on pensions liabilities to basically fund the economy, urban regeneration, environmental projects. There's a lot of things that we really believe we can do good with the money we've got. And therefore, for us, this was a time to really send a message. We must step up in this time and really show that we're still investing and we're still trying to help. And I was just before this call, just looking back at the announcements we've made to the market since the 23rd of March, and they are relentless. And, you know, the last one I saw was that we're taking a 75% stake in a ground source heat pump company, you know, in June. So for us, it was really important to step up, actually. And you know, I appreciate it's been difficult for a lot of people, but I think we also think this will fundamentally change the way office workers work. At least it will for us.
Thank you.
Thanks.
I'm sure
Thanks for having me. Yeah.
No, a pleasure. I think this is a topic we're going to come back to, in fact, and what's going to happen to offices and things. Maybe Jude, from the perspective of sustainable development and in London, maybe you can take us through the transition for you and how that's been.
Hi Martin, and hi rest of panel. Thanks a lot for having me along to today's event. Yeah, well, I mean, it was kind of like I imagine a natural disaster to feel like, in a way, which I've never been a part of, thankfully. But there was for us anyway, there was quite a massive intake of breath and just checking that everyone was okay in our team and then wider within the organisation. We were quite agile as well. We're just going through a big transformation programme at the GLA, so we all have sort of home working set up. So physically, we were sort of all set up to transform quite quickly to a home working scenario, which did happen very quickly overnight, as probably most people remember. And then most of the activities that we were focused on, I sit within the sustainable development team, is worth mentioning, and what we do is we provide a secretariat function to the London Sustainable Development Commission, which advises the Mayor of London on his duty to deliver sustainable development across the capital. And what happened to our team was we were redeployed, so there was an appreciation that actually we needed to respond to the crisis pretty quickly. The GLA, as a sort of strategic body across London, has got various responsibilities and abilities actually to respond quite quickly to the crisis. So, you know, things like food banks, coordination of food banks. So that's one example of where you need a sort of central body to coordinate activities and fill the gaps. So we had team members who were redeployed over to support the emergency response. Quite a few members of our team were redeployed in terms of policy response. So we had various policy initiatives that we needed to pivot quite quickly. And obviously, if there's any budget implications of that, it needs to be coordinated strategically. So we were part of a group of cells that were created across the organisation to coordinate those sort of policy responses as part of an immediate response to the crisis. And I think we've moved on now. So I think it's gone from that sort of emergency response function much more to looking at recovery. So firstly, transition out of lockdown, as it were, but more so now looking at longer term recovery and what that looks like. And it was a chance really to reaffirm the priorities that the GLA has, and from my team's perspective, obviously zero carbon commitments is a major one, but I think the other thing that really has come up through this crisis is the structural inequalities across London and how this crisis has really shone a light on that, and a real need to I mean, we talked about green recovery, but a real need to make it an inclusive, fair recovery as well. So for me, it's great in a sense, because for me, it reaffirms the value of sustainability and sustainable development. So it's not just about zero carbon. We're looking at how do you also create the social and not just environmental outcomes, but the social outcomes as well. So green jobs, inclusive growth. So that's what we're doing at the moment, and the LSDC is involved in helping shape policy response internally at the GLA, but also helping to push nationally. So we wrote a letter to the Prime Minister, for instance, which I know a lot of business groups have done as well. So, you know, calling for various things, you know, we can talk about later, but, you know, deregulation in London to allow the mayor to raise more finance and do the things that he wants to do that will make a choice, make a difference, but also embed sustainability within the recovery. So, yeah.
Thank you, Jude. And Ritu, from the perspective of organisation like Arup, and your expertise in transport, of course, the last few days, I would imagine, have been quite interesting, hearing the government's commitment to rebuilding the economy, and building being the most important word in that, I think, and the focus that they're going to have on doing things. How's the transition been for Arup from being immediately within the COVID crisis like us all, and then thinking about the future?
Yeah, hi Martin, and hi everyone, good afternoon. So right when lockdown happened, we were within our team, I sit in the transport consulting team at Arup, we were working on this document around climate emergencies and actions for transport to address the climate emergency. And we were about to launch it. We had planned to launch it in just a week after lockdown, and we had to rethink, actually, does this document need to be redone now in light of what's happening? And we had a lot of internal discussions, and I think what we came down to was, well, actually, everything that we're talking about is hinged in the long term, and the long-term objective of taking action on climate change hasn't changed. If anything, this situation kind of demonstrates the need to take action and the urgency to take action, because more of these disruptions will happen if you don't address climate change. And the issue becomes about building resilience into your systems, into your organizations, to be able to deal with the reality of these disruptions, which are going to happen, and still be able to continue to make progress towards your long-term goals instead of putting them on hold because you're dealing with emergencies. So I think that's the approach we took, and because of the launch of that document, we were engaged a lot in this discussion of COVID and long-term goals and climate change, much like today. And it was interesting because at the same time, the DfT launched their decarbonizing transport plan and announced that they would be developing this plan this year. And So what does all of that mean? I think it's interesting when we talk about the fact that air quality has improved a lot since this has happened, and the fact that there are all of these kind of natural benefits of being close to the environment and not driving less and being more active that are becoming more apparent to people. But I think it places decision makers in a difficult and maybe an uncertain situation, because everyone is guessing at what the ultimate response will be post-COVID. So to what degree will these habits and this appreciation carry on, and to what degree will we go back to normal? And I think my personal opinion is that policy and government really need to take a hard stance at what is our priority and what's the kind of change we want to continue encouraging and accelerating, and what are the risks that we want to guard against. And I think that this conversation does need that kind of structure, because otherwise we start just thinking about the future plainly as if we have no role to play in the future, and the future is going to happen and we're going to have to respond. What will people want to do? Will everyone want to work from home? Will no one want to live in cities? And, you know, is the office going to disappear? But I think it's a really tricky situation, because there's a bet you have to make on what you think people will want to do. But I think it's more than a bet. It's also about remembering why we had the visions that we did, you know, in the London plan, or for the cities that we did to begin with. And how do we, given what's happened and given what we've learned from this experience, use that knowledge to accelerate towards that vision? So I think quickly, if I think about some short-term key things to keep in mind and some long-term things, to me, that's about realizing that recovery is going to happen in stages. And one of the biggest things for public transport is going to be giving people confidence and reassurance when they start to use public transport or start to think about public transport. So, you know, agencies are suddenly going to, and this has been a long-standing need, are going to need to think less about their service and a little bit more about communications and marketing. So how do you ensure people feel like public transport is a safe option for them? How can you leverage digital technology to make people feel like social distancing is possible, or for them to keep up to date on what are the most crowded stations and what are stations that are open and you know, in real time are accepting people, and what's the safest way for you to make your journey sustainably to where you want to go? I think there's a greater risk in suburbs. We talk a lot about cities, but suburbs are actually the place where people are more car dependent, where there is maybe some unused capacity on the road network for people to start using cars more. So actually, how do you guard against going backwards on any progress that you've made in suburbs, and make sure that you don't use public transport ridership or active travel usage in those places? Because I think right now we've been talking a lot about local trips, and things like slow streets in San Francisco and street space in London have taken off, and everyone is talking about active travel. But I think if we don't address the need to make those longer distance journeys, then there's a risk we're overlooking the potential impact of, you know, public transport not continuing to be a confident choice that people can make. I think there's a big risk in terms of equity in the near term. So because government has had to make some really rapid decisions to control their deficits, to keep on making sure you can continue, I think some groups have been overlooked and are at the risk of being further overlooked. So I think the protection that you have in place to make sure people who don't have alternative choices need to stay in place more than ever, instead of being kind of pushed to the side in this rapid decision-making process. I think in the long term, very quickly, thinking about whether people will stay in cities or whether they'll go into suburbs, or if everyone's going to work from home, I think government should also be thinking about, well, what is a healthy environment? What is a healthy community? And I think part of that means continuing to stay connected. Yes, we have to social distance right now because that is just how you get past the situation. But if we think about how we design cities, if we compare that to engineers, structural engineers don't design buildings for once in 100-year earthquakes. So it doesn't make sense to be designing cities for once in 100-year pandemics. We need to make sure we stay resilient in these circumstances and that we have a plan and we don't make haphazard decisions when these things do happen. But it's our long-term objectives of good health and well-being, of ensuring a good environment that should actually guide these decisions instead of what seems to be happening just now. So I'll wrap up there.
Thank you ever so much, and thank you, four of you, for those introductory comments. We've got a lot of questions that are coming in right now, and I'll try and sift them in a second. We've had one that's come in, and I was going to ask this already, and it's really posted for Lily, but I'm sure others will think about it as well, and that is, does some of the responsibility fall to workplaces in London to make to release the pressure on public transport? And if so, how are you engaging with businesses in London to effectively manage the amount of people on the network?
Yeah, no, it's a hugely important part of the equation, and we have engaged very closely with all the major employers in London. We do anyway. Because there's always smaller things or events happening or ways, it's a discussion that you want to maintain. But for example, if we think about the stages coming out of lockdown, the probably most significant was the opening of retail a couple of weeks ago, because currently most offices are still shut. People are still working at home. That is the government's message. But we engage really closely with retail to enable them to make the decision around opening much later. So they are generally have staggered their opening hours to after 11 and have a later closing hour. That's enabled us to maintain a lower peak flow, because knowing that essential workers are coming in much earlier in the morning. And we're doing absolutely the same with schools. Another major source of demand, and then workplaces as well. So each understanding the journey patterns that each type of operator generates, and then talking to them directly about their location, their journey patterns, and how they can either smooth that, look at other options, make it work the best way they can.
Thank you. I wonder, when we're speaking about transport, there's lots of new ideas about how you move from one part of a city to another. And maybe, Jude, a lot of this comes down to sort of sustainability as well. And in particular, I'm thinking about more people walking, more people cycling, the recent announcement that e-scooters are going to be legalised. All of a sudden, things are changing quite quickly in the context of a city. And impacting on sustainability as well. How are we engaging in those new decisions that are being made, and behavioural change as well that's being modified?
Yeah, well, I mean, the rise in micro mobility, as it's called, I believe, it's a really interesting move. Yeah, I mean, in terms of how we're engaging, I think that for us anyway, I mean, the critical thing is how you integrate it into a sustainable sort of transport system within a city. So, you know, how it works with everything else that's going on. And then for us as well, how do you, I mean, we've talked about this before, but how do you make it inclusive? So, you know, who is going to be the winners and losers from this? And particularly, I read I think it was the Royal National Institute for the Blind had some real concerns about the legalisation of e-scooters, and particularly, I think the speed limit, which I think is set at, I think it's 15 miles an hour or something like that. And they had real concerns as users of space. And the impact on that, and I think we have to be very careful in terms of balancing the benefits, and obviously this is core to sustainability, isn't it? Really, it's about optimizing the benefits across all three pillars of sustainability. But we do need to think about who are the winners and losers in any initiative like this, and particularly those groups who might not have access. Who might be, adversely impacted by these sorts of initiatives. So, it's a difficult one, and I think it's, you know, it has caused an awful lot of headaches for an awful lot of policymakers in terms of, you know, initiatives that seem on the surface to be really positive, and actually when you drill down to them, there are certain groups and individuals who will be really adversely impacted by those, and it's about that, you know, reaching that balance, I guess.
Rita, maybe we can sort of go on a little further with this. So I'm conscious that you are someone who is into transport design, right, and making it work. How much are we should we focus on systems rather than building objects for this new world that we need to develop ourselves?
Yeah, the way I think about it actually is, when we design something or when we propose something, there is the systematic impact that has, and then there's the impact on the individual. And I think oftentimes, actually, this might be taking the question in a different direction, but I think oftentimes what happens is the public sector tends to think about things in terms of systems, because government is responsible for making sure the system is operating, and also in guarding against system-wide impacts and constraints, whereas the private sector is always trying to appeal to the individual and appeal to individual demands and individual needs. And what ends up happening is that when the private sector is very successful in appealing to individual demands and needs, that ends up scaling up to having a systematic impact that the public sector didn't necessarily forecast, because they were kind of looking at the problem from a different point of view. And I think, coming back to your question, that when we design a solution or when we design a project or a system, we need to be thinking about how can this appeal to the individual. So how can this work beyond just the project that we're considering or beyond the district that we're designing, but how does it actually affect the individual? And then how does it incentivize the individual to behave in such a way so that when individual responses get scaled up, it benefits the system instead of acting against it?
Indeed. So I mean, one thing just to say, e-scooters are going to be legalized, but actually what we have to think about is how they work in an integrated way.
Exactly.
Yeah, right. And it's politicians and decision makers quite often put these things in, especially at the moment when everything is moving so quickly. And yet we're all left with trying to understand what that actually means and how we work things out, right?
Yeah, and I think realistically speaking, actually, we'll never know in advance how that's going to play out, and that shouldn't be a reason for not trying it out. But I think what you have to recognize is there might be certain risks, or there might be certain negatives of this thing expanding, and we need to monitor those risks and make sure that we have an action plan for when this goes beyond being a positive and starts turning into a negative.
Thank you. Pretty, from the perspective of LNG, you know, I would imagine in an ideal world, you want things nice and stable with lots of pre-warning about things which are coming up, and so you can put measures in place. And when things are happening really quickly, that must make it quite a difficult proposition for a company like yours. Do you feel you're ahead of things? Do you feel you're having to react very quickly to things which are going on? What is the sort of general feeling about how you're operating now with respect to all of these things which are starting to change?
So I think there's the logistical part of the way we're working, and that is frantic, how are we going to cope? But I think if you're an insurance company, well, at least from our perspective, we have a big strategic view. Okay, the strategic view is the retirement market, and helping pensioners get paid is really, really important. But at the same time, we have a strategic view that to do that, we should also be investing in long dated infrastructure, and some of the things I'm sure we'll come to, but we should be thinking long term, be thinking sustainable. And the other big gap we see is indeed, or the gap that we think we need to step into, is climate change and climate change management and mitigation. And you know, it's something that combines both. And Ritu, I think you said you had a similar experience is, you know, in November, we all went off, top leadership of Legal in General went off to London Zoo, to the Zoological Society, and spent a whole day thinking about all the action we're going to take to make sure that our portfolio, our company, we are doing the right thing in order to manage to net zero, and also to keep the companies we invest in honest. So we went away and thought about all the actions, and then of course we came back beginning of the year, get to March, and suddenly we also had to rethink. We had to rethink how we were going to implement the ideas we came up with, but what we didn't rethink was the strategy. The strategy stayed exactly the same because long term we know that's what we need to do. So it's I hope that answers your question. You know, there's tactical things we need to do, but long term, strategically, nothing's changed for us.
Okay, last question for me. Yep. Last question for me before we go to ones which are coming in. So, and it's for anybody who wants to answer this. I heard Alex Sharma, the business secretary, yesterday trying to defend Boris Johnson's statement that they're going to build a lot of homes, right? And in particular within cities, that's a critical issue, as we certainly know in London. And one of the things that Boris Johnson said is that we're going to change regulation, right? And it was sort of pointed out that actually there's also houses that have been given planning permission, just haven't been built. So he said, give me an example of how this is going to work. And he said, the only example he came up with is that there are so many companies that are holding offices in London and they don't need them anymore. They can be transferred into housing, right? So my question is, and that's from the business secretary. So from your perspective, your collective experiences, is that something that is a good idea? Is it something that's feasible? Is it something that can make a difference? I don't know who wants to go first. Lily.
Yeah, happily jump into that. You know, I guess one of the issues is who wants to live there, and we have to see what is, people are coming into cities currently because the offices are there. If the offices and destinations aren't there, then yes, it might be attractive that you could reconvert there. And there's a massive pressure for housing space in London, so there's got to be some potential benefits here. But the issue is people have to do something and want to be in these spaces. And the fact that they are just create a housing is that's not how you create a community. So my worry in removing planning controls, or the discussion and the debate that goes on a planning thing, is that can often bring to light all those connections and other factors that need to be fixed to make a place nice, to make sure it's got transport connections, to make sure that you've dealt with the environmental impacts of that development. So could be a part of the solution, but if there's no filters or controls in there, you can't guarantee it. And again, it's back to that e-scooter discussion. We won't know what the impacts are unless we're monitoring it, and we need to have some processes in place for that.
Thank you, Jude.
Yeah, can I also say that you know, that there's a real problem, or a potential problem, with unintended consequences of something like this. So the other value of commercial units is on sort of local high streets. And if you have a blanket transformation, not saying it would be blanket, but you know, a transformation of commercial to residential, and you're potentially losing engines of economic growth at local level and at central level as well. We have to be really careful about decisions being made that will have wider impacts. That, like you said before, you know, that there's things are moving really, really quickly. Decisions are being made very quickly, but there are unintended consequences of those decisions down the line, which need to be factored in, and someone needs to, you know, do that thinking sooner rather than later.
Thank you. Well, now we've got a lot of questions which are coming in now, and people are able to offer them a like by clicking the thumbs up button, and I'm going to read out one or two of the most popular ones. And one here is from Iyad Zimo, who says, do you think the most effort for change should come from academic institutions, the private sector, or the public sector? we can do a quick round here, if you like. Priti, what do you think? Academic institutions, private sector or public sector? Who's at the front line on this issue?
I think they all have to go together, otherwise we'll fail. When we are moving to create the long dated assets that I touched on, that might be, you know, the urban regeneration of a town in a green way, we actually, you know, we go out to cities in the UK, we can't do anything by ourselves. We have to really work hard to work with the local government, have them absolutely on board and try and put things together that are going to help us both and not just one of them. Everybody has to have the vision and be on board with it. And whereas academia, as far as academia is concerned, you know, the reason I know you is because we reached out to your institute for help to make sure we are doing the right thing, to make sure we're putting proper measurement around our investments so that we can hope to actually have the right metrics for looking at the carbon intensity of investments, for example. So I think all three, I think perhaps private and public largely, but academia needs to be there too.
Ritu, what are you thinking from the perspective of Arab on these things? You know, are you relying on government, for example, to come up with initiatives that you plug into, or actually do you feel you're sort of setting the agenda on these things?
No, actually, so because we do consulting, oftentimes our client is someone who's part of the government. So I think my thoughts on this are just echoing what's already been said, which is in reality, all three of these players shape actual cities and decisions and what we end up doing. And I think what doesn't happen is that all three of these sides come via their own individual interests and their own kind of ways of doing things, and we don't end up optimizing their respective strengths. And so I think the question isn't really where is it going to come from, because it's going to come from all three, but it's also how can these three better align themselves to actually create something that is what we're aiming to get, instead of just something what ends up happening. And, you know, that's something that we end up reacting to. So I think government is always aware of the problem that they're trying to tackle, but they kind of tend to do it on their own, or they tend to do it in the way that they've always done it in the past. And they don't always necessarily open up their doors to say, we have this issue and we want the best ideas to come. And that way you engage the private sector, you engage academia, and you get the best ideas in front of you.
I mean, I have to say it's one of the reasons, many reasons, of course, but one of the reasons that Imperial College has such a thriving alumni network is because of this exchange, because of this sort of putting together people in academia, people in the public sector and the private sector, building conversations, building collaborations. I think that's something that we all share. Okay, question from Melanie Winrich for you, Priti. So LNG has investments in things that can have big societal benefit, for example, fusion energy. Are you unusual in this way? What is required to widen this to more companies to get involved?
Great question. So are we unusual? To be honest with you, it's simply that if it's the type of insurance we do is one thing, and yes, there are other insurers who do what we do, which is basically if you have to pay a pension for a very long time to somebody or a big pool of people, and we pay 1 million pensioners basically, we also what's the smartest way of paying those pensioners? It's to invest the money we have from them in long dated assets. And what are long dated assets? They are rental properties, they are construction projects. They you know, a lot of them are built around construction, or they may be renewable energy projects. So we have to invest for the long term. And, you know, from that perspective, we're doing it because it's the right thing to put against the payments we have to make. Now, I think we are actually unusual in really going a step further and saying, actually, we can do this. We can We can invest in long-term assets, which are good for us because we need them to pay pensioners. But while we're doing it, we can really make a difference to local and national environments, basically. So we can really, we can regenerate cities. Yesterday, I found out we have completely renovated the site where Newcastle Brown Ale was brewed up in Newcastle, and that's not something I knew. But what does that involve? We built a science park. We've completely regenerated an area. So I think absolutely we can do a lot of good with the investments we have. How do you get other companies involved? A lot of insurers who do what we do, which is pay, act in the retirement market, they have followed us. And now if we're bidding on a wind farm project, we're actually bidding against a lot of other insurance companies. And that is, that's a development over the last probably 5 to 10 years. We've had a rush of people following what we're trying to do. And now sometimes I'll listen into the results of a competitor and they sound just like we did 5 years ago, and it's quite fascinating. And more broadly, not to dwell too much, we've seen, and we according to our estimates, we think there's £1 trillion funding gap for infrastructure in the UK over the next 10 years. Okay, and we think companies like us can play a huge part in that. And I know Boris announced 5 billion for infrastructure a couple of days ago. That's a drop in the ocean versus what is needed. So I think we really do have to get stuck in and really put our money where our mouths are, and we're doing that.
Maybe from the perspective of transport, Ritu, if you were to say, so with so much investment is needed, is there a prioritization? Is there like a high level thing is it like rail we must sort out? Is it more local networks, from a sustainability? I doubt it's going to be aviation. So what are the big things that we really need to make ourselves more connected?
That is a very, very big question. And I think the answer to that question will vary depending on who you ask. Yeah. And it kind of reinforces the need to have a clear national vision and a clear local regional vision. It's interesting, actually. So you commented and said you doubt it's going to be aviation, but there is all of this demand that the aviation sector previously responded to that some of it will come back. Aviation demand tends to come back very quickly. At the same time, we have this climate crisis, and the aviation growth isn't necessarily helping that crisis. How do you continue to nurture the benefits of long distance travel, of global travel in a sustainable way? So fine, if we don't invest in aviation, actually, then where does that investment go? And what's the role then of rail in at least taking the share of aviation that previously accommodated long distance travel within a nation? What are the new rail corridors that suddenly become viable then, if government decided that that these trips now need to happen more sustainably? Suddenly links that were previously competitive via air become the new rail corridors. So yeah, I think there are so many ways that this could go. I mean, this would be an entire study of what is the priority for investment. But I think my personal view is rail is going to be a big part of the future. It has to be.
Thank you. Please.
Could I come on that one? Yeah. So I mean, I think taking a city perspective, and cities are where most people live, and there's two ways of looking at that. If we look at the externalities of transport, most of those are driven by car use at the moment in cities. That's what's driving public air crisis and clean air crisis, as well as lack of active transport. So if you look at the strategy for a city like London, it is clearly twofold: to invest in mass transit, further capacity on the public transport network. Now there is a need to go back around that in view of what will the future demand be in light of the pandemic, and people, whether working from home fundamentally changes commuting patterns. So capacity might be slightly reduced in terms of that. But I think the reconfiguration of the urban form and the street space will continue to be massively important, because this is what will enable more local journeys as well as medium length journeys by bus and by cycling in particular. So that's not the whole national picture, and clearly intercity rail will be really, really significant. But I think if you can get it right in the cities, you begin to model a type of sustainable transport option, which then can flow out from there.
Thank you. We've got a question that's coming from, I don't know your first name, A. George. But thank you for the question. Really, I think for you, Jude. So the question is that the transition to remote working seems to be a highly sustainable option for society. Okay, I think we'd all agree with that. Low emissions, fewer buildings, less consumer waste. But paradoxically, it may lead to a decline in city economies. How are we going to balance this idea that people are going to work from home more than come into cities? And is that a problem actually for a city like London?
Yeah, I think it is. I think it's a huge potential problem for a city like London. And I mean, I think it goes along with another development, which is the development of local hubs, local centres. So I think what you've seen is you've seen a resurgence of the local high, well, not a resurgence of the local high street, but a resurgence of local areas. And I don't know who it was who said London is made up of however many villages, but I think there's that notion of it being much more decentralised now, and that the growth potential going forward and the new model for the way that the city develops is more sort of local centres. But I can't remember who said it earlier. There are real benefits to the density that comes with cities, and in terms of the efficiency of our systems, in terms of carbon emissions, in terms of material and resource flows within cities. You get so many more benefits with that sort of centralisation, and if we lose that, then again there are lots of unintended consequences of that. So whilst I think that yes, broadly there are some real plus points of home working, which could impact things like business travel, for instance, and reduction in carbon emissions associated with aviation from a business perspective. That might be one of the upsides. I think in terms of cities and city planning and city carbon emissions, I think there are real dangers of that that we have to look at and we have to plan for. And I agree with Ritu. I think we need to take a vision sort of approach to this and how we get out of this, and to set. And I've been reading the work of an economist called Mariana Mazzucato. She works at UCL, and she's a real exponent of the emissions-based approach to planning. So, we need to set ourselves some really ambitious missions in terms of where we want to get to. And I think that looking at how we recover as a city and what that means in the future and how our cities work effectively, and we get all of the benefits of those cities, needs to be one of those missions, and we need to work out how to do that. So it's not all it seems, I think, the home working boon.
Indeed.
Could I just comment?
Please do.
I agree with that, and I think just to add on, obviously this is my opinion because I think this is a big debate and no one really knows what's going to happen, but I think the way I look at it is it's kind of like the rise of automobiles and how everyone thought, and to a large extent we started planning in this way, so we made it happen, that cities are no longer really relevant. No one really needs to live in cities. Everyone's going to prefer living in suburbs. And it's what happened in America, which is the creation of these suburbs and these long commutes and these huge interstate systems. And then what happened after that, 30, 40 years into that, is the rise of urban living, and suddenly you have the Silicon Valley, which is made for commuting and leaving, and you have San Francisco, which is becoming this new thriving center. And all of these extremely high-paid tech employees who work in the Silicon Valley choose not to live in that suburban environment, but choose to live in San Francisco and take 2 hours to get to work, but just so that they can live in that vibrant environment of the city and still work in the jobs that they want to work in. So what does that tell us about human nature? And I think this question just gets raised again and again, and we risk making the same mistake again and again, is that we think somehow some new technology has lessened our need to meet physically. I'm not saying it's not going to have any impact, but I think it was already having an impact. It's letting people have flexibility where they need it. It's letting them have agility in their lifestyles as they prefer to, but I think it has its limits, because as soon as you have 3 people in a conference room in real life and you have 1 person calling in, suddenly that 1 person calling in is just not as present as everybody else in the room. And there's a disparity in the connection. And I think to some degree, my personal opinion is that that will always matter. And we might create ourselves a new problem if we ignore that.
Thank you. Very last question, because we are running out of time. Excellent hearing all your thoughts and things. And I'm going to merge 2 together. One's from Barbara Hollinger and the other's from Jeremy Brown. Jeremy's talking about how do we get behavioural change? You know, we like to sort of carefully nudge behaviour, but in the last few months feels like a push in the back that we've all been changing our behaviour. And the other is on technology and the role that technology plays. And there's a balancing, isn't there? Looking into the future, what is going to be more important? And we can do a quick fire round going through the panel. Is it going to be behaviour going to drive things, or is it going to be technology that changes things? Lily, what do you think?
I think it's probably behaviour. I mean, I think that, you know, technology is an enabler, but unless you want to use that technology or respond to it, it's not going to solve the problem. So if I had to plump on that, that's where I'd go. Thanks.
Good. Okay, Jude.
Yeah, I agree. I think yeah, technology enables you to get there, but actually if you don't want to get there and you're not willing to engage or participate, then you know, we're not going to get there. So behavior change and communication, effective engagement is going to be absolutely critical. Okay,
Pretty.
Same page. I think the fact that we're all doing this webinar means technology's there pretty much. I think it's really will be our behaviour going forward. Yeah.
And me too.
Same thing, but I just think they're not comparable, because successful technology enables behavior change, and it enables the kind of behavior change that the individual prefers to engage in. And the idea is to leverage technology to incentivize people to engage in the kind of behavior that will benefit most people instead of just that individual.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. I'll answer that question because, you know, we're Imperial College of Science and Technology, so it's important that we try to understand the things that we're doing at Imperial and versus the outside world. I think the next few years for the college is very much going to be thinking about how the great things that we do at Imperial College can shape this amazing transition that's going to happen all around us. How we can apply technology, develop it and apply it in ways which are commensurate with people's needs and behaviours, and having those discussions like this and many others are really important to us. And so listen, thank you to the 4 of you. Thank you, Lily, Pretty, Jude and Ritu, for such being with us, but also for your amazing contribution today. It's very much appreciated. And I'm going to hand back now to Corinne.
Thank you.
Well, this brings the event to a close. Thank you to everyone who joined us today, and thank you to all of our panelists, of course. There's clearly a lot of interest in the subject, and we do encourage all alumni in the audience to continue the conversation on the dedicated event board on Imperial Plexus. A link will appear on your screens very shortly, and just note that you will need to log into your account to activate it if you haven't done so already. We would also love to hear what you thought about the event, so please do share your feedback through an online feedback form, which will also appear in the chat in the next couple of moments. And finally, look out for an email from us next week, where we'll share the recording alongside some useful resources with you. On this note, thank you all again for attending, and we hope to see you again soon.